Okay, good evening. I'm Joanna Marsh. Oh, it's really dark out there. James Dickey, Curator of Contemporary Art here at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight. Before we begin the program, I'd like to ask that everyone turn off their cell phones and all over the other mobile devices. We're going to have a short question and answer period following the lecture. And if you're interested in asking a question of our speaker, there are microphones set up on either side of the auditorium in the aisles. If you could go to the mics and address your questions there so that our audience who's tuning in via webcast can hear your questions as well. Tonight's program is the second lecture in a series that explores the intersection of visual art, science, and environmental change. The series has been organized in conjunction with our current exhibition, Alexis Rockman, A Fable for Tomorrow, and is inspired by Rockman's unique cross-disciplinary approach to art making. You can see the exhibition in our third floor galleries, and you can hear more in the Art and Science lecture series later this month and into the early spring. There will be lectures by Tom Lovejoy, who is the Biodiversity Chair at the Heighten Center for Science, Economics, and the Environment here in DC, Steve Monfort, who is the Director of the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute, Rhonda Rowland Shearer, who's co-founder of the Art Science Research Laboratory in New York, and Christian Samper, the director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History, will be speaking in April. And all of the dates for those lectures can be found in the calendar section on our website. There are few people better equipped to talk about the connections between art and science than this evening's speaker, J.D. Talasek. J.D. is the Director of Cultural Programs at the National Academy of Sciences here in Washington, where he focuses on the interplay between science, medicine, technology, and visual art. He's curated numerous exhibitions at the National Academy of Sciences featuring the work of Tim Rollins and KOS, Mike and Doug Starn, and the photographer Terry Falke. In 2009, he organized an international online symposium titled Visual Culture and Bioscience, and he's currently partnering with the International Society for Arts, Sciences, and Technology, better known as Leonardo, to present a monthly discussion forum for art science projects in the National Capital Region. Talasek holds an MFA in Studio Arts from the University of Delaware and an MA in Museum Studies from the University of Leicester, and a BS in Photography from East State University. He's taught photography at the University of Delaware, as well as Essex and Howard Community Colleges, and is currently on the faculty at Johns Hopkins University in the Museum Studies program. It's my pleasure to welcome JD to the stage.
Thank you, Joanna, for that very kind introduction. And also thank you to the American Art Museum for inviting me here tonight. And this is probably one of my favorite museums of all times, especially here in DC. With my office just 2 blocks away, I'm able to haunt the galleries here on a regular basis. But I'm most honored to be invited to participate tonight in this lecture series on art and science. The discourse around art and science has a growing number of practitioners, historians, theorists, and others who are interested in the intersection of ideals. The term art sci or sci-art already has a specific history as it is used in contemporary discourse. As Suzanne Anker mentioned in her introduction to our publication of the online symposium that Joanna mentioned, Visual Culture and Bioscience, the term is most heavily rooted, according to Suzanne, in the work of Ken Arnold and the Wellcome Trust of the UK. The Wellcome Trust is a pioneering science foundation that has supported the intersection of artists, scientists, and institutions aimed towards innovative projects. And the Trust has paved the way by providing a model for a lot of our institutions who are working in this area. But now looking back on it, even Ken Arnold would be the first to admit that the label art science has its limitations. Although it presents an easy portal into the conversation, it also sets up a limiting dichotomy of thinking. We all have our ideals of what art is and what science is. What is really much more interesting and fertile ground for discourse is when we consider what lies between them. This requires a blurring of our own ideals of the traditional structures of disciplines. In fact, this blurring is necessary in the light of seemingly vast advancements in understandings of science and technology. Our definitions of disciplines have had to evolve along with the production of knowledge, and we see this happening by hybrids such as chemical engineering or biochemistry, etc. A discussion of art and science is merely the next step in redefining and rethinking established disciplines. Science and technology permeates every aspect of our lives, so it is little wonder that artists who function as observers, cultural critics, recorder of ideals, and at times provocateurs, they should take notice. So what we are really talking about when we say art science is the constellation of ideals that occur at the nexus between all disciplines. For this reason, I'd like to sing a brief song of praise to Joanna, not only for the years of blood, sweat, and tears that she put into the Rockman exhibit, but for the catalog and her insightful essay contribution. I highly recommend reading it. Her essay draws a beautiful constellation of ideals across disciplines such as art and science, history, literature, and environmental movements, thus illustrating my point that I hope to make tonight of the importance of the perspective that we glean from such an exploration. Additionally, I want to say thank you to the museum for hosting the exhibit itself. For several years, many artists who have been working at the nexus of these disciplines have felt ignored by the art community and by the art press. The exhibit provides an important validation for these artists. I will start tonight with a disclaimer. I'm not a scientist. I find that most people who I meet and who I tell that I'm the director of an arts program at the National Academy of Sciences don't know exactly what I am. My background is that I'm an artist and a museum professional. So my perspective is this: as an artist, I'm interested in processes and find it most interesting to consider the similarities of art processes and science processes. What do they share? How can they learn from and inform one another? As a museum professional, I'm interested in the question of cultural display and how that mechanism conveys ideals. How does meaning change when art is presented in a science context or an art museum, and how does that change alter the discourse? Shortly after visiting the Rockman exhibit, I received an email from my colleague, Alana Quinn. She was excited, of course, about the exhibit, but more importantly, she commented about how the number of Rockman's ideals and explorations resonated with projects that we have worked with over the years and the ideals of other artists that we have engaged with. So this gave me the idea of how I might structure this talk tonight. And since the exhibit is a foundation for this lecture series, and we have heard from Joanna in her gallery talk and from Alexis, I would like to use their ideals as a foundation to paint a slightly broader picture of the art science discourse through a few examples, and hopefully this lecture itself might provide a platform for the ideals of the remaining speakers of the series. Drinking water is going to be a constant theme for the evening. As Joanna has pointed out in her catalog essay, Alexis makes repeated use of the tree of life metaphor, a metaphor often associated with the evolutionary ideals of divergence. The use of this metaphor by early ecologists has embedded the image of a tree with a history of ideals that Rockman builds upon to express contemporary concerns and fears. Metaphors are often employed in the communication of science and are powerful tools, allowing us to wrap our mind around complex and often abstract ideals. And to state the obvious, metaphors are part and parcel to the endeavors of the visual artist. It may also be stating the obvious to say that metaphors, of course, have their limitation. The visual may guide us to points of understanding and discovery, but it does not prove nor provide empirical evidence. Yet logos such as this one, used at the Second Eugenics Conference in 1921, draws upon the power of metaphor as a tool for propaganda and to persuade and convince. We only need to look at the history of the Nazi movement to be reminded of how scientific ideals can be usurped to a catastrophic end. And within Alexis's paintings, we find evidence of the artist's knowledge of science, his shared sense of awe and wonder in the act of discovery. However, he does take creative liberties, blending fact with fantasy. This, to me, underscores an important role of the artist, not simply to be an illustrator of ideals, not to answer questions or to provide proof, but to ask questions, to raise concerns, or simply ask us to laugh at the fallibility of our actions. The cultural exhibit of artwork provides a platform for such discourse, an arena in which facts as well as fears can be expressed, contemplated, and shared. So returning to the history of the tree of life metaphor, Darwin's Origin of Species contained only one visual illustration, the illustration seen here on the right. But years earlier, he made this sketch in his journal depicted on the left. It was this sketch that provided the visual inspiration for a 2009 commission by my office, commissioned by the artist, or from the artist Tim Rollins and the KOS, to create a work based upon Darwin's ideals. For those of you who may not be aware of their work, Rollins and his students, who named themselves KOS, short for Kids of Survival, first began receiving recognition from the art community in the 1980s. Formed in the Bronx, the collaborative was initiated by Rollins and consisted of students at the high school level and below that had been labeled by the educational system as unteachable. The teaching approach Rollins adopted was simple and elegant in its concept. Engage the minds of the student by engaging their hands in a creative art-making process. Every work by the collaborative is based on classic literature, and the pages of the book often literally become the foundation for the work. The commission of work based upon the Origin of Species follows in this vein. Rollins and the KOS created a stencil of Darwin's sketch of the Tree of Life, an iconic image which itself has been synonymous with evolutionary history and exemplifies the power of imagery to transform our very thinking and our perspective. But as the students discovered in their research, however, contemporary evolutionary biology is built upon and clarified Darwin's original ideals. In other words, the original visual metaphor is somewhat incomplete. It has been suggested that Darwin's original drawing of a tree might be better replaced with the visual metaphor of a web, thus better signifying the complexity of evolution as it's understood today. The ideal is manifested in the finished piece. By repeating the stenciled Tree of Life over a grid formed of pages of Origin of Species, the collaborative established the ideal that Darwin's original drawing was the building block on which the ideals of current evolutionary biology are built. Throughout this process, the collaborative has made it their own through the act of learning and research. Rollins and the development of his teaching methodology reflects the fact that not all students learn the same way and that alternative teaching practices can be very effective in reaching those that do not learn in traditional environments. Rollins' process exemplifies the fact that art as an educational tool and art as an exploratory tool are not necessarily exclusive endeavors. The research done by the collaboratives is an act of informing the work, while the visual interpretation of the material allows the student to find personal relationships to the content of the literature. Today, the collaborative's work is in the collection of many international museum collections, including a recent acquisition by the American Art Museum. But perhaps even more significant is the fact that many of the students who were written off as unteachable have gone on to receive college degrees, scholarships, and achieve further accomplishments. In fact, we are currently engaging one of the KOS members, Ben Volta, on another project. Ben is engaging a group of students in Philadelphia area to create work based upon biographies found on the Academy's African American History Program's website. This website features a collection of biographies of outstanding African Americans who have contributed significantly to the fields of science, medicine, and engineering. The process is similar to the approach by Rollins. The intent of the project, called Historical Catalyst, is to give the students the experience of a collaborative process while providing them with inspiration to strive towards their own great accomplishments. Although this is a project that is currently in progress, the students have already begun to generate sketches such as this one, inspired by the biography of biologist Charles Turner, who is known for his work in the area of animal behavior, focusing specifically on bees and ants. Images of the visual culture surrounding the scientist's work are depicted around and within a silhouette of the student artist's own profile, visually suggesting that the student's imagination might be stimulated not only by the work of the scientist, but by visualizing themselves as a generator of ideals. Another example of artists working with the power of metaphor to convey meaning is a collaborative team of twins, Mike and Doug Starn. We became aware of their interest in neurological imagery around 2004 and worked with them to create the exhibit Absorption and Transmission. The importance of neurological imagery cannot be overstated. Much of the advancements made in the field of neuroscience over the past several decades can be directly contributed to improvements in imaging technology, thus providing a great example of the role that visualization plays in scientific processes. Mike and Doug, who rose to international acclaim in the 1980s with their photography-based multimedia work, have always used the power of juxtaposing culturally charged image to build connections in the viewer's mind. Combining old and new technologies, they explore the complexity of interconnectivity of meaning that is embedded in visual culture. Images that compared the human vascular and neurological systems to the structure of trees suggest a poetic connectivity between organic structures. Their work explores the way that meaning is created and conveyed through art, literature, and now how new imagery such as that created by medical imaging technologies, for example, might also have metaphorical potential. MRIs and other imaging technologies are common enough in popular culture as to be recognizable, and therefore the imagery produced provides fertile ground for expanding the artist's visual vernacular. The exhibition, Absorption, Transmission, represented a larger exploration by the Starns related to the ideal of complexity and the transference of knowledge. They utilized the metaphorical potential of new imagery in this investigation, as exemplified here, an image of a tadpole's neuron, which is then layered with images of trees that mimic the structure of those neurons. The images made by both traditional photography processes and medical technologies are digitally printed on mulberry paper and then layered over one another, creating a work that is more sculptural in nature than merely photographic. The act of layering these images while combining old and new processes and materials in itself becomes a metaphor for layering and the connection of ideals. The imagery of the tree, again, evokes deeply rooted traditions, in this case in visual art and literature, as a metaphor for knowledge, from the biblical reference, the tree of knowledge, through to the Darwin's tree of life, while visually resonating with the branch-like structures of the neurons. The Starns were interested in exhibiting at the NAS because the context of the site itself would provide yet another layer of meaning. At the same time that Mike and Doug were conceiving the work for the NAS, they were beginning to conceptualize a piece that was just actualized last year on the rooftop of the Met in New York. Big Bamboo, as the piece is called, is a piece that is part architectural, part sculptural, and part performance piece. It incorporates 5,000 bamboo sticks that are tied together by performance artists, actually trained mountain climbers, to create a massive growing and evolving structure. So once again, we see the metaphor of the tree visually utilized to address the idea of complexity that is further underscored by this comparison of the work of Rollins and the Starns. Jumping around chronologically in the Rockman exhibit, we see his exploration of landscape traditions in art. The image of an iceberg has become iconic in our time, representing the ideals of climate change and global warming. These massive structures, almost as foreign to our daily experiences as Martian landscapes, evoke feelings of awe and the sublime. Yet the melting rate of these structures also forces thought of change and the impact of climate change on our environment. a visual vehicle for a number of other artists whose works address similar concerns. During his talk, Alexis talked about the quality of the light that radiated from the icebergs. I thought his talk evoked the ideals of other painters such as Church. And the same visual phenomena of light is also seen in Camille Seaman's images from her series The Last Iceberg, which was premiered at the NAS in 2008. In her series entitled Monuments, photographer Lynn Davis presents yet another perspective on these formations. The layer of meaning added by the title Monument suggests the irony that these massive formations, on one hand, seem like quiet, permanent testimonies immune to time, yet they are dynamic and in constant changing state. Through the act of photography, Davis preserves and documents these structures in a style that alludes to the work of German photographers Becker, who documented and recorded soon-to-be extinct industrial structures in a direct and unromanticized manner. Philadelphia painter and photographer Diane Burko is currently engaged in an ongoing series of paintings titled Politics of Snow, where she seeks to contrast past and present situations of glacial activity. As seen in this triptych, she draws on as a source for her paintings the ways in which we record and document, exploring the aesthetic meaning of tools such as photography, both her own and those found in text and records, and other topographical notations used by scientists, as seen here on the far right. And this is another example. As you can see from the size that I have down there in the right corner, they're quite large. Joanna, in her gallery talk and her essay, make a number of references to the environmental movement and how these ideals are preserved and discussed through the vehicle of visual culture. The ideal of our interaction with the environment that we exist in seems most prevalent in the final apocalyptic series of images in the Rockman exhibit. But what is the impact of visual culture on our perspective and our behavior towards the environment? Such direct impact is difficult to gauge. However, according to the Sierra Club's website, Ansel Adams's images were first used for the environmental purposes when the Sierra Club was seeking the creation of a national park in the Kings River region of the Sierra Nevada. Adams lobbied Congress for a Kings Canyon National Park, the club's priority issue in the 1930s, and created a limited edition book, pictured here on the left, where they claim influenced President Roosevelt to embrace the Kings Canyon Park ideal. The park was created in 1940. But fast forward to the 1970s, when another emerging group of photographers rejected the idea of depicting the utopian landscape void of man's presence in favor of showing human presence in relationship to the land. Photographers such as Stephen Shore, whose work is represented here on the right, joined in a landmark exhibit at the George Eastman House in 1975 entitled The New Topographics. This exhibit, which was not well received at the time, has since changed the direction, spirit, and aesthetic of the genre of landscape photography. The bodies of work that have grown out of this exhibit are vast and have been lectured on frequently, so I will just introduce a couple to illustrate my point. David Mizell, who is a former assistant to the photographer Emmett Goen, is a prolific artist working on a number of different projects at any given time. David's aerial images depict environmentally impacted sites and explore the aesthetic politics of such sites as open pit mines or zones of water reclamation. You can tell without a sense of perspective, they become these beautiful, large abstracts. Terry Falke, who is a photographer whose working technique of using a large format camera harkens to the traditions of landscape photography, but I think it is more accurate to view his work through the filter of social documentation. A former student of Stephen Shore, Terry is an observational artist who is attuned to details, incongruities, and sometimes unlikely beauty in the civilized American terrain. He is fascinated with the quirky things that humans do and the relationship that we create with the environment. We all enjoy being out in nature as long as we have paved roads and sidewalks and shelters from the environment that we are actually seeking to experience. As you can see, his photographs contain a visual wit while offering very powerful cultural and social observations. During Alexis's talk a few weeks ago, he mentioned an early influence of attending the Natural History Museum as a child and being influenced as an artist there. This is neither unusual nor surprising. I've worked with a number of artists who have made the same claim. Think for a moment, the act for the scientists studying natural history collections is primarily one of visual exploration. It is at the heart of their research and the primary reasons for the collections to exist. It is a natural fit for the visual artist to be attracted to such museums for similar reasons. This, combined with the fact that public display within the museum, in the form of dioramas, for example, has been raised to an art form itself. Within the past few years, the Smithsonian has developed a truly innovative program, in my opinion, an artist residency fellowship program. Within this program, artists are invited to spend time with the various and vast collections that the Smithsonian complex has to offer. I've been privileged to see firsthand the interaction between many of these scientists and artists, each becoming excited by the fresh perspectives and challenges of the opposing epistemologies. I'm told that a high number of applicants specifically request to work with the collections of the Natural History Museum, which underscores my point. Artists and natural history collections are a likely fit. Other artists who have found displays within the natural history collections or has found the Natural History Museum a worthy subject include photographer Sugimoto, who photographed the dioramas of the American Natural History Museum in New York City. Sugimoto was driven by a feeling of how fake or distant the original dioramas appeared. By photographing the dioramas and printing them in black and white, they somehow felt more real, achieving a feeling of timelessness through the medium of photography. Currently, there is an art installation at the Museum of Natural History across the street, the Crocheted Hyperbolic Coral Reef. This installation is a wonderful example of the intersections of art, science, and community to teach, learn, and raise the awareness of environmental issues. The act of crocheting, as it turns out, just happens to provide a perfect model for visualizing the hyperbolic form. The reef that's on display across the street was formed through the contributions of thousands of crocheters in the community, creating in itself a metaphor for what a reef really is, a community of diverse organisms. I won't dwell too much on this, as there are a number of programs going on around town related to this exhibition, so I encourage you to Google and tap into these programs. In addition, I think one of the other speakers is the director of the Museum of Natural History, which I hope that he will address this more as well. But for the sake of my point, I raise here is an example of an art exhibit that is presented in the context of a science museum, and I hope that there will be many more like this that the community can take part in. The Coral Reef exhibit is partially supported by the Australian Embassy, so it is appropriate for me to transition towards another Australian-born artist, Justine Cooper. Brooklyn-based but Australian-born multimedia artist Justine Cooper was the artist in residence at the American Museum of Natural History a few years ago. Using a vintage wooden 4x5 camera from the museum's collection, Justine's photographs share a glimpse into the museum's vast storerooms. Only a small percentage of any natural history museum's collections are actually on view at one time. So her work reveals an unfamiliar sight, but it also tracks the trail of scientific collecting attitudes and practices that reach back into the 19th century. So here are a few examples of the images that comprise the body of work that Justine called Saved by Science. I imagine that some of these images might have raised concerns with the museum's officials. On one hand, they reflect the very real history of collecting practices and attitudes, which in my opinion make them very powerful reminders. But I can also imagine that they might fear that environmentalists might mistake that the museum collection of collecting practices of accepting trophies from big game hunters might still be in practice, which it is of course not. There was a video that accompanied the exhibit. I'll do my best to try to describe it, as I wasn't able to embed it into my PowerPoint. But Justine mounted a video camera on a cart and pushed it through the seemingly endless corridors of the museum collection rooms, starting with the older part of the museum where the cases were wooden, and moving through time seemingly to the newer, more contemporary storerooms that contained high-tech equipment. The audio of the video is the sound of birds in nature, serving as a reminder to the viewer that the artifacts stored in the cabinets were once living creatures. When I saw this painting of Rockman's, I couldn't help but recall the work of Tracy Hicks, who is the only artist that I know who actively breeds frogs in his studio as part of his creative exploration. When I visited him in his studio, he had glass cases in which he estimated contained hundreds of frogs at that time. Many of his frogs housed in his studio are believed to be nearly, if not completely, extinct now in their natural environment. Concerned with this fact, he works closely with scientists and environmentalists to understand the cause and impact of this fact. For example, the poison dart frog, as it is commonly known, which has the ability to transmit a potent toxin through its skin, has been nearly wiped out in the course of just a few years by a fungus that has long been present in their environment. This fungus, for reasons that are not totally understood, has become fatal to them, it is absorbed through and damages their skin. So as Tracy points out, their strongest means of defense has become their point of greatest vulnerability. Tracy is one of the artists in the Smithsonian Residency program that I previously mentioned. His interest is in finding correlations between human skin and frog skin from a cultural, historical, and scientific perspective that will eventually inform his work. This brings us to this image, which was taken as part of his research here in the Smithsonian collection. The images that Tracy is making are beautiful and enticing. And it is easy to think about Tracy's photographs as the end product of his artistic exploration, but that would be incorrect. Tracy is a collector of found objects and an installation artist. His photographs and videos are merely a form of note-taking that mimics the process of a naturalist who might draw and make notes as a method of their research in the field. This visual process culminates in installations such as what we see here. My first physical exposure to Tracy's work occurred at this installation at Wright State University in Ohio during their Darwin celebration. During the process of planning this installation, Tracy studied the work and methods of Darwin, submerging himself in his writings and his notes. Tracy followed many of Darwin's methods of notation and collecting as he himself collected objects for the installation. The result is a physical manifestation of a scientific process with the intent of sharing the wonder, awe, and excitement that is found within this process. Another side note on Tracy's process that I find interesting is his use of social media to engage a community of friends, mostly scientists and artists, for feedback on his work. In this way, he is not limited to feedback from only those who can physically make it to his studio, but he can engage with others as often as he feels the need. It begs the question of how artistic processes are changing within the 21st century due to technology. I have to admit, though, that it was standing in the presence of this installation at Wright State, exploring the details and connections that the artist was inviting the viewer to make, that I first fell in love with Tracy's work. I imagine that I felt the real human reason for why a naturalist might collect in the first place. Scientific ends are always noble and desirable, of course, but what I imagine is that the collector is initially more driven by a sense of wonder. The visual logic in which the pieces of bones and other items were arranged produced a sometimes poetic, sometimes witty, sometimes profound sense of connectivity. With no glass or barrier between me and the objects, I was a voyeur looking over the shoulder of a naturalist at work in his lab. When we were organizing our Visual Culture and Evolution Symposium, which was held online last April, Tracy was a participant, but we did a keynote interview with a renowned biologist, E.O. Wilson. Dr. Wilson, who is now retired but still active, recalled how the visual culture of images found in a National Geographic magazine was what first triggered his interest in science, and that visits to the Natural History Museum as a child and the desire to become one of the scientists, or as he put it, to, quote, become one of the gods who dwelled on the third floor of the museum, end of quote, was what led him to a career in science. I'd like to end with a quote from the introduction to the book, Brain and Visual Perception. David Hubble was part of the team that won the Nobel Prize for 1981 for discoveries concerning information processing in the visual system of the brain. Dr. Hubble wrote, quote, "We have always felt that scientific papers in the styles of today go out of their way to keep concealed the very things a reader may most want to know. What led the authors to ask the questions in the first place? In what order were the different parts of the research taken up? To what extent was luck involved? What were the surprises? Was it fun? How much competition was there? And above all, perhaps, who were the authors and what were their lives like? Today, most papers seem dry, their juices sucked out, with little sense of the delight that can accompany discovery. Doubtless, the authors have wanted to give the impression of scientific rigor, following a custom of scientific writing that treats science with a capital S as something with a separate existence that is independent of the humans who are responsible for it. We find this attitude unfortunate, but in our papers we have had to adhere to today's customs or face fierce editorial resistance," end of quote. The cultural exhibit of work by artists interested in scientific themes provides a space which we are allowed to ponder the impact of ever-changing science and technology on our lives, where we can express fears, voice our concerns, and be reminded of the wonder and awe that surround us. Thank you very much for your time and careful consideration. Oh, and this is a bit of shameless promotion, so you'll have to forgive me. As Joanna mentioned in the introduction, we will be starting on February 16th, just a couple of blocks away, what's called DASERS, DC Art Science Evening Rendezvous. And it's our hope to provide a snapshot of what's happening creatively in the area and to provide a sense of community. So I hope that you'll join us there. So I believe now we've been asked to turn this into question and answers, but I prefer a discussion, if you don't mind. Question and answers assumes that you all just have questions, and it assumes just because I'm up here behind the podium that I have all the answers. So if anybody would like to join the discussion, please approach the microphones. Or yell at me from the audience.
JD, you mentioned at the outset that this intersection of art and science is just sort of another form of interdisciplinary studies. I'm wondering, is there any reflection yet of that in the academic world? Are there any programs out there at any of the colleges and universities?
Most definitely. It most definitely is, and it's, as I alluded, one of the science institutions that has really been a primary funder is the Wellcome Trust, and of course, you know, where there's money, of course, there comes interest. But in the UK, in Berlin, and in Australia, there's many programs already, PhD programs such as that. Justin Cooper worked with, what is the group? Symbiotica down in Australia, which is a lab, it's the first one of its kind that actually trained artists in the biology labs along with the scientists. And we're starting to see that here. There's, I think, 4 PhD programs that now that are in the States. The most recent one is University of Texas at Dallas, which has just recently been approved to offer a PhD in art and technology. So yeah, I think this is becoming very, very similar. And you see even without these formal programs, you see a restructuring within the schools to allow scientists and artists and people from different disciplines an opportunity to engage with one another.
And of course, a lot of colleges have interdisciplinary programs that allow undergraduates to design their own majors. So maybe that's another.
That's another layer of it. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Rocco.
JD.
Well, hold on. To borrow from Marina Abramovich's show in MoMA, the show title "The Artist is Present." So this is Tracy Hicks, who I talked about here at the last. So now he's going to confront me.
Well, that's what I intend to do.
Good.
You know, you have a unique view of what's happening now, art, science, the relationship between. You didn't mention C.P. Snow and the debates in that time period, but looking back over history, it's evolved this direction, that direction, back and forth, a pendulum swinging. Why now? I mean, there's a unique synergy that I see going on now, and you have a perspective on it that's unique. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I mean, I think as you alluded to, I mean, it's nothing new. I mean, Da Vinci had all of these, you know, he's actually, you know, the sort of the stereotype of, you know, when you say art and science, that's always the first thing that comes to mind. But I think that it has a lot to do with knowledge production. The silos for so long in our museums and in our schools have built this incredible amount of information up that now it becomes important to build bridges across the disciplines. And I think that's where I see a lot of the interest is people are, you know, they're looking for new innovation. They're looking for new ideas, and they're looking across outside of their disciplines to find it. I think from my perspective, that's what I'm seeing mostly defines. Do you have a different perspective on it?
I have
Tracy?
a slightly different perspective, but you know, as the economy goes down, the arts that are about social change have always gone up. The arts that are about the provocative arts jump forward when there's a compression either in the economy or the culture or the governmental structure. And we're seeing a lot of pressure now, and there's a tremendous amount of acceptance. The work you've shown tonight, a number of those artists I've seen little bits and pieces of, but not much of. But there's an energy for that that I think is related to the compression, the cultural and social compression that's going on right now, the frustration about religion in art and the relationship between the two, religion and science and the relationship between the two, creates a triad that's probably been there forever. And right now, it's the artist's job to be the provocateur in that process. So I think you're seeing a lot of art energy being put into it, and I'm curious how that's going to be received.
Well, and yeah, and I think that it's, you know, and this is why I think that, you know, so much praise for the American Art Museum and for Joanna for bringing the Rockman show here is there's a perception of artists working with ideals of science as it being a bit of a shtick, you know, within the art community. And, you know, the fact that this exhibition is here is, you know, kind of moving in the direction of a broader acceptance. There was a exhibit just a few years ago that toured called Paradise Now, which was a survey of artists who are working with genetics and themes in genetics, of which Rockman was a part of that show. And the curator, you know, who was part of our first symposium, said it was almost completely and totally ignored. But now, you know, we see a change, you know, with the show here. CAA conference, the College Art Association, has a growing number of panels that discuss it. So I think that this is fertile ground. I mean, I think this is going to be a very lively and active group, and I think the American Art Museum is kind of certainly paving the way by validating
Sure.
this discussion.
Well, I've just been asked by the American Association of Museums to do an installation on the future of natural history museums and art in relationship to natural history museums. So it suggests to me that there's a lot of synergy in that community, in the museum community, to expand on this thought process.
Well, and certainly the Museum of Natural History, as alluded to with the Crocheted Reef, they're very active in trying to start an arts program, as you know, and the Museum of Natural History in London has a full-time art curator, or at least it did last time that I, talked to her. So yeah, I mean, I think as I mentioned, in the slide presentation, I think the Natural History Museum's a perfect place for that to start because they're both visual explorations. So there's a lot more of a commonality. So
You've got somebody over here too.
yes, thanks, Tracy.
As you said with Da Vinci, and it's almost a cliche that scientists used to have to use tools of art and artists used to use and study the tools of science in order to understand the body. So Da Vinci is looking at cadavers and so on to understand.
I'm sorry, I can barely hear you. I think it's on, but I'm not.
So Da Vinci and other scientists
Oh, thank you.
use tools of art to access the body, and artists also use tools of science like studying cadavers and so on. That's many centuries ago. Do you see today artists looking to modern science like the Bratton mapping of brains or so on, neurology, in order to understand current and modern practices of science and applying that to art, not just glowing rabbits also?
Right. Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, it's I guess the way that I structured this talk tonight is I really kind of wanted to focus on the themes that's in Rockman's work, but certainly the tools are there. There's so many artists that are exploring perception and neurological images. I just touched on that ever so briefly, but the advances in neurology and neuroscience are greatly advanced. And just the fact that we have come so far in understanding how the brain works. Neuroscientists are very interested in looking back at how previous artists have explored these concepts before and realized that the artists had it right, that they kind of foretold a lot of the experiences that we heard before. So thanks for the question. Thank you very much.